lot of the investment right now is based on the training part, but inferencing is where I think it counts in the longer term.
Yeah, and I think like in the past, in previous episodes, we've talked a lot about. I think especially just before the new year, we talked about how OpenAI investing more and more on the reasoning side has shifted the development of AI away from upfront training to inferencing. And with that, I think there's a lot of startups that are invested in the inferencing side of things. What makes it interesting is if inferencing becomes cheaper, because previously I think we've kind of gone through three models of economics for AI. The first initial models, you would have a huge capex investment, do a shit ton of training, and then the inferencing is pretty quick and cheap. But the problem is, quick and cheap inferencing means you're not getting very good results. So reasoning models has flipped it around. Your training cost is a little bit lower, your inferencing cost is much higher. And so that changes the economics of AI because now you have a higher variable cost. But now I think with DeepSeek and having a much cheaper inferencing cost, we now have a third paradigm, which is basically where things are cheaper on both ends. I think even in this world, even if inferencing is cheaper, the economics wise, businesses building AI are still going to rely on a higher variable cost. That is going to be how they have to think about their business because there's a non-zero cost incurred every single time you use it. It might be cheaper, but there's still a non-zero cost incurred.
Yeah, but having said that, right? I mean, you and I, we've all built products using LLMs before. I mean, one of the things that I was most scared about when building AI products is what if people use it too much? What if they ask too many questions? Because every question's costing us 20 cents per like prompt, let's say. But if
Yeah.
all of a sudden that prompt cost me 1 cent per prompt or even lower, that changes the game. It means I'm not afraid of people using my product. I can charge lower costs for the end outcome. I think it just makes a huge impact to how builders think about building into the future.
I think it makes some use cases a bit more viable. And I think this is probably our first big debate or discussion point. But I think from an economic standpoint, you still have a variable cost. And I think that's very different from the traditional SaaS businesses that VCs love, because for traditional SaaS businesses, you have a fixed cost of hosting the servers, but every time a user is clicking, it's not incurring net new costs. Like, yeah, maybe there's a little bit of compute. And I guess but that's not necessarily tied to every interaction. Versus here, there is a non-zero cost. It might be lower. You may see more businesses feel viable, that it's viable to enter the market when the cost goes from 20 to 1 cent. But what that means is you're going to lower the cost that you're selling to users, right? Let's say that we start with, you're pricing at $1 and it's 20 cents per every, user interaction. Your margin's 80. When you lower the cost down to 1 cent, other people are going to enter as well, and you're going to be lowering the price you can charge the users. And so at the end of the day, you're still going to be squeezed because if you have a margin, someone's going to come here and compete away your margin. And it's hard to get away with that because you have some variable cost involved.
Yeah, but the game has changed, right? The Gone are the days of an 80% gross margin SaaS business. If you're a SaaS business right now and not trying to incorporate AI into some of your capabilities, you're going to be left behind. So I think we're just going to have to assume that these token costs are added cost that, you just have to deal with moving forward.
I think and I think we'll get into it a little bit later, but I think it's certainly going to make the economics of AI businesses interesting. I think the businesses that do the successful that just assume that you have to eat that cost, they're not. There's going to be a business that revolutionizes how they use AI, where they're not incurring AI costs for every single interaction, and those are the ones that are going to succeed because now they will actually see a scaling factor involved in the pricing. But anyway, I think we are going to talk a bit more about that as we get to the later points here. And so I want to move to the next point in terms of what has made DeepSeek successful. Alan, I have my thoughts, but I'm curious on your thoughts on what you think of what differentiates DeepSeek and how they became successful.
I mean, I think the main thing everyone's talking about is the distillation methods that they've been using. Effectively, DeepSeek is using apparently some of the outputs of some of the existing large language models like OpenAI and Anthropic, and using that to optimize and train its model. But with that said, I think, Albert, you've got richer insight into this. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think distillation is certainly one. I think what's really interesting, and there's been a narrative of this, is basically the United States policy on chip restrictions for China. We talked a bit about how the DeepSeek model works in the last episode, but to summarize, basically their big innovation was finding ways to work around communication bandwidth issues in the chips. So what I mean by that is, again, the big AI chips right now, the H100s of the world, these are basically a whole bunch of smaller pieces, kind of stuck together, and they have to communicate with each other. And so people thought that if you limit the communication between the different chips, you're not effectively able to access the full potential of the chip because it takes longer to communicate between them. And so the export version of the H100, which is the H800 that DeepSeek has access to, has those limited bandwidth concerns. And so the United States, based on the export policy, thought, okay, sure, this means that it's not going to be as powerful because all models, the current approach to training relies on leveraging the entire power of that chip. And so what the DeepSeek engineers did, and also DeepSeek, their CEO only likes to hire like fresh graduates without a lot of experience because they don't, they're not limited by how things work. They basically saw this constraint and came up with an elegant solution to work around that constraint, which is how do we do a training method that does not require us to, or it limits the amount of times we need to access, the entire chip. How do we limit the amount of times we need to leverage that limited bandwidth? And so that's when they're doing multi-token predictions and, different ways to optimize around that limitation. And it's because of that limitation that they went and built the DeepSeek optimized model. We can argue that if the US policy did not exist, then DeepSeek in its current iteration would never have existed because there was no reason to build a DeepSeek. So I think it's inadvertently, the constraints and the challenges posed by this policy was what forced them to be crafty and make this happen.
Yeah, and there are some new rumors coming out right now that Nvidia may be subject to even further bans around some of their chip makers. But the follow-on effect to that is that, chip makers within China, like Huawei's of the world, it's just going to increase, their race and their need to develop faster chips. So China for them to develop their own chip industry even further. So, it should be another effect.
Yeah, we'll still see. I'm like, at least because lithography is capped to them. Like, I think they are producing some very nice chips right now, and they are growing in efficiency. But I think they will hit that hard limit of what they're able to achieve on DUV technology. I think they're still limited at the 12 nanometer node, whereas TSMC right now, the leading chips are on the 2 nanometer node right now. So I think they'll continue. China will succeed in optimization and efficiency, but the ceiling that they hit is going to be lower than the ceiling that domestic chip makers will and domestic AI companies will have.
Yeah. And, DeepSeek has not released the most revolutionary model out there. It's merely matched the capabilities of some of the existing OpenAI models, but at a lot lower cost. Uh, One thing I also want to dive into here is maybe some context on DeepSeek. Now, there isn't a lot of information about DeepSeek, but apparently it's one of the hedge fund billionaires from China who's pursued DeepSeek as a side project. And there've been rumors before this export ban that he'd been stockpiling these H100 chips. Now, the big question that comes to my mind is, you know, if a wealthy individual in China with a group of smart people has been able to do this, can other countries actually do this? Like, in terms of like a sovereign AI piece, right? And I'm originally from Australia, and I've been thinking a lot whether Australia, number one, should try to pursue their own sovereign LLM, and whether they can even. And I think the answer is, for country like Australia, we do have AI talent, but it's not at the same scale as, as what China really has. But having said that, we probably wouldn't get access to the latest chips right now because they're all being sold to the hyperscalers. And we all know how difficult it is. We had Elon and Larry Ellison apparently having dinner with Jensen Huang, hand in hand, paying for these new Blackwell chips. And I think there is still an element of capex investment that's required. So you do need someone like a hedge fund billionaire who's willing to invest significant amount of capital to pursue these different aspects. But it's just an interesting theoretical question out there whether smaller countries like Australia or South Korea, Japan, Germany, England, UK should actually pursue trying to build their own models here. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Albert.
I think that's a great. I really like that question because I think it tees up our next two topics very well. I think there's two offshoots of your question. It's, can smaller players end up building their own LLMs? And I think that is going to be influenced by that's going to heavily influence the chip makers and what the ramifications are for them is in terms of them creating the capabilities and these new players coming in to buy their chips to create their own LLMs. But then the second question is, should countries like Australia and South Korea and the smaller businesses, should they create foundational models? And that, I think, it hits our second point there. So I'll answer your question as we go into both of these, but I certainly think that's a very interesting point because I absolutely do think we are going to see a lot of new players enter the market and want a LLM because in the past they were priced out of it, and now that it's potentially cheaper, it increases the likelihood that people are going to come in and do it.
Yeah, because I mean we'll talk about it more as we go through it, but that can be an ongoing theme. With that said, this week we've seen a huge decline in a lot of the listed chip makers. Nvidia down 17%, about 600 billion wiped off its market cap. Apparently the largest single day loss of market cap in the history of the...
They also have the second and third largest market cap losses in history.
Yeah, so it's obviously been a tough day for a few people. But having said that, what do we think from here? Do we think it's overblown? Do we think it's there's still going to be continued investment from the hyperscalers? How does this impact both the training aspect of the chips, but the inference capacity as well? We've had Satya, Microsoft CEO, talked about Jevons paradox, talking about how the impacts may actually increase the use of these AI LLMs, and then the impacts on energy. So with that said, let's just dig into the first topic. So Albert, do you think the chip mix declines are overblown or not?
I think the demand for chips is going to continue to exist. So I think the overall broad-based market decline, I definitely think that's overblown. I think, and I don't think I'm alone in having that opinion. But I think the reason for this decline is because the story around AI has changed. I think up until now, and even I think in our one of our previous podcasts, we were talking about the death of the scaling law, right? The idea that you pump more money, more chips, more data, and you get better and better models. That was already kind of seeing the end. But that was the blue sky scenario for the Nvidias of the world, right? Because that's just saying you need more and more Nvidia GPUs, because if it's a race to AGI, I think the market was thinking of it as a race to be the first company to reach that magical jackpot where now they get this high return on investment. And so to get there, you have to keep investing in GPUs to make that happen. I think that's kind of how the market's been thinking about it. There's really not been anything to detract from that Nvidia story for some time. We are finally reaching that point where now the limit is not the sky. There is now a potential limit to how much hyperscalers are going to want to invest in GPUs, because previously, before this Deepseek's innovation, I think the market was thinking of it, okay, if we invest X amount, then we will get Y return. But now you're thinking of it as, if you can get Y return by investing X divided by 2 or X divided by 4, right? And so that inherently and mathematically limits how much demand there will be for Nvidia. So I think that 17% decline is because the story has changed. Not saying Nvidia is 17% less valuable. I think they certainly have room to run, but the story has changed around AI. It's no longer an infinite world anymore.
So the challenge behind that is that the size of prize is still so big out there. So there's still a bit of a game theory paradox here.
Yeah.
Where, okay, all of a sudden, the cost to train these models are a lot cheaper. Okay, you know what? I'm not going to spend as much as I had originally planned. And then you're like, okay, I want as well. But secretly, I'm actually going to go buy up those Blackwell chips that you're not buying anymore. And among the hyperscalers, if I get there first and you don't get there at all, or it takes you a while to get there, how does that impact my business if the size of prize around AGI and, AI is so big where it can revolutionize almost every industry that it hits? So I think there is yeah.
I guess the argument there is if you're able to punch above your weight, the business that doesn't get all the Blackwell chips or the Hopper GPUs, like those companies can still achieve a slightly smaller but respectable return without investing the amount that the top hyperscalers do. So that I guess that's the argument is you don't need to invest in that much. If you are investing that much, you're actually being irresponsible because your return does not scale.
But I think the question is, what is the size of prize or the incremental return?
I don't think it's a winner takes all market. I think that's the thing. It's not a winner takes all market because as we're seeing, foundational models are becoming increasingly commoditized. And so the companies that invest the most in training these models have the most to lose because they spent so much money on something that is just going to, someone's going to copy and achieve with a much lower cost. So what's the benefit in investing so much in chips then?
So again, I think there's still a lot that's unclear. Like with AGI, with traditional or with these new distillation methods, as an example, can you get to AGI, or do you need something like do you need the power of tens of thousands of Blackwell chips to get that? I think that's still a big question mark that's out there.
It is, I guess, and this is we should definitely talk about this on a future podcast. But the question is AGI worth it? We're painting this rainbow, and there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Is the journey to find it worth the cost? Like, or will the benefit outweigh the cost? I think that's the question that a lot of investment firms have right now. I don't think there's clarity either.
Because no one knows what AGI looks like.
Yeah.
Everyone has a slightly definition in their own minds of what AGI actually is, right? And to be honest, like I'd be surprised if anyone in the world knows it, even including Sam Altman. I think he has a picture of it, but what it actually looks like, I mean, I don't think anyone's described it in a clear way.
Putting it aside, let's say you can get to AGI. The question then is you invest, let's say $300 billion and you get AGI. And then I invest $100 billion and I get AGI. Were you was your 300 billion a responsible investment?
Okay. But here's the thing. Do we know that your 100 bill can get to AGI?
So I think that's exactly what Deepseek is showing us. Deepseek is showing us that yes, it is possible that because of distillation, what's going to happen, like the way that this works, bringing distillation back in, OpenAI invested billions of dollars to create their O1 model, their O1 reasoning model. Then DeepSeek came along and used OpenAI's O1 output to create their model. So the thing is, they're a free rider. OpenAI incurred the heavy cost. If you think about the actual total cost of DeepSeek, it's not just the $5 million. It includes a lot of investment, but that investment was borne by OpenAI. So if you are the company like OpenAI or, these hyperscalers are investing billions to create these models, someone is going to copy you and do it for a much lower cost. That's what distillation is.
Okay, so let me play a devil's advocate here. So there's been reports where OpenAI has noticed a significant amount of API calls out to particular users. Could there be a scenario where anytime they detect an anomaly of API calls, now they shut access to their models down.
I mean, they certainly could, but now think about the implication for their business, right? Well, I could get around that. Like I worked in security. I know there's a lot of ways to get around that. You could look at that, but then what happens if I divide it over 2 APIs? What if I divide over 10 API calls? Like a 10 accounts, 20 accounts, 50 accounts, 100 accounts. You'll never know.
Yeah, fair play.
Yeah.
Okay, we talked about training. Let's talk about inference, and I think this probably ties into some of Jevon's paradox here. So around inference, we do see the cost of inference decline significantly. But having said that, do we see a counterbalance effect where the volume of inference actually increases drastically as well? Because due to the cost decreasing, it unlocks significant amount of demand. It's just like the internet back in 97 when it was slow, when it was expensive, you had less people using it, or the iPhone on day one, right? As the cost of these things. Yeah.
So I think there's two things. I want to talk about inference, and then I'll talk about Jevon's paradox, because I actually think inference and Jevon's paradox are not directly linked. For inference, the cost of inference is indeed coming down, but because we are still in that model where inferencing is more important than training, I think the way that companies are going to bring inferencing down is not the mechanism that Deepseek is using, but what they're going to be doing is they're investing more in custom silicon so that they can create chips specially purposed around inferencing. Like this, and this isn't a new paradigm. Like AWS and Microsoft, they've invested in FPGAs for Azure and AWS and Azure, which reduce the cost of providing edge services by like 60%, 70%, right? And so what this is going to do is, I think, from an inferencing standpoint for chip makers specifically, this is going to hurt Nvidia, I think, because you don't necessarily need the general purpose GPUs. Like, yes, they're good, but it's overkill. It's like using a sports car or like a Formula One racing car for your daily commute. Like, that's not the best use of it. Their companies are going to invest in custom silicon to bring down the cost of inferencing. I think that's the first. I think that benefits the Broadcoms, the Marvells of the world. If you look at Meta's most recent earnings, they're increasing and Microsoft as well, they're increasing their investment in custom silicon for their own custom Meta and Microsoft AI chips. And I think the mix is going to shift more and more to custom chips versus general purpose GPUs. So I think that's the impact on chip makers first. And then on Jevon's paradox, well, I have a whole bunch more I want to say there, but I want to hear your thoughts if you have any different thoughts on inferencing, because I know we talked about this in the past as well. I'm very bullish on custom silicon as the future for AI chips, and so curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know the attraction of Blackwell is the training aspect, the race to get to AGI, right? Once we move into a world of inferencing, which takes up the majority of the compute, do you need that Ferrari when you just go into the grocery store, right?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think you're right. Like, which is why we see Broadcom shares rally. We see Meta shares rally as well. So yeah, agree with you on that point. Happy for you to dive into Jevon's paradox.
Now this is where we're gonna disagree. So here's the thing. So I think so. Yeah, just to illustrate Jevon's paradox, right? Jevon's paradox came around in the late 1800s with coal. The idea being the invention of steam engine is now much more efficient, and so because it's more efficient, steam engines use less coal. However, because steam engines use less coal, it's basically led to a phenomenon where more and more consumers feel that they're able to use it more, and that leads to increased demand, right? Because now it's cheaper, and so cost was the limiting factor preventing them from using it. And so the argument that you made earlier is cost of inferencing goes down, and so what that means is previously consumers were not using AI as much because the cost was so high. Now that the cost is lower, we're going to see a phenomenon where a lot of people are going to use AI more and more because, again, cost is a prohibiting factor. I want to challenge that. I am going to disagree with Satya here. I don't think cost is the limiting factor limiting AI. I think demand is the limiting factor limiting AI. Specifically, I think even if we drop the cost of AI inferencing to zero, Do we think that overnight AI use is going to skyrocket? And I don't think that's going to happen in the short term. Maybe longer term, but not short term for sure.
So not overnight. The use cases, and arguably even with the O1 or O3 models, is just not good enough to replace people end to end.
Yeah.
But when you can imagine a world 5, 10 years, maybe even shorter, where all of a sudden you've got an AI model or agent that's better than a lawyer, an AI assistant that's, better than an EA, right? Or AI plus robotics, where you've got a robot in your house helping you around clean dishes and can answer things and help you just like a real human. I think when you get to that level of proficiency around AI, you know, and where AI touches every part of your life, you've got a self-driving car that drives on the road and picks up people was it as a as an Uber. You've got a cleaner at home, you know, rather than go out talk to a lawyer, an accountant, even within large enterprises like call center staff, sales staff. If it ever gets to that point, that's where you see the demand pick up. And I think that's what Sati is talking about. Agree with you short term, we are still a while away from that. But longer term, if you believe in that's what the future looks like, then think about how much inferencing is involved just from a day to day of like anyone.
Yeah. And I think we will have to think about those use cases. Those use cases are key.
So just one thing like that. I think the interesting point is that a lot of the inferencing is going to move to the edge. So it's going to move more locally in order to make these decisions. Like your robot is not going to be connected to an API and send a request every time it needs to do something. It's going to have a local, chip that it can make these decisions and run these models on as well. So I think there's also the energy aspect, but also the compute requirements on a local chip are obviously quite different as well. So it depends use case to use case, I think. But
yeah, but I think longer term, those use cases, I mean, we don't know if that future is going to pan out or if consumers need that. I'm going to take a little bit more of a grounded or / pessimistic view. I don't know that customers are necessarily like just because we have AI lawyers and stuff like that. Uh, I don't know that that's the one thing that gets people to really use uh, AI. I will say, I think the cost coming down means there's going to be more and more AI startups out there, more businesses exploring how AI can work. And I think that that will likely create some of the innovation that leads to that world. We don't know what that world's going to look like yet. And I think right now there still hasn't been that clarity on what are those killer use cases for AI. There's a couple of companies benefiting from AI, but right now, only 5% of enterprises have deployed AI, and only 7% see deploying AI in the next few years. So it's still sub 10% for the number of businesses that there's a lot of companies exploring AI, but companies actually fully deploying AI is still very, very low.
Okay. So when did the internet come out? 95? 94?
You're using the same argument that is used to justify crypto.
Crypto has limited use cases, just to mind you. More speculative, more store of value, maybe some crypto specific use cases, whereas AI is completely different when it comes to the use cases, right? I think the argument I will make in 97, 98, how many companies had a website?
I just still early days.
Yeah.
I know where you're going with this.
My view is that it's still early days. You cannot discount, human advancement over the next 50 years.
Okay, so do we think in the next 50 years that crypto is going to be important and embedded in every part of our life? But how many companies had a website in the 90s? We're still early on in this. I think. Look, I agree with you. I think we will see AI continue to grow. I'm giving you shit, but the reason for that is I think the arguments of we're still at the early days, that is a total that's total shit, because the same argument can be applied for crypto, for any technology that's failed. you could say the exact same thing. It does not mean that time is the factor. I think the use case is definitely going to be key to make this work.
This is the difference, and I don't want to get into a whole crypto debate here, but I'm just going to say this one thing. Crypto has limited applications in real life use cases. AI, on the other hand, has almost limitless use cases. That's the key difference here. It's the
I think consumers are still skeptical of those use cases. I do not think that AI has done anything because here's the problem with crypto. Every crypto use case could be solved without crypto. What are the AI use cases that cannot be solved without AI?
almost every
Name one. Give me one.
Okay. So let's say you are manufacturing a robot to go into everyone's home, and you need to give clear instructions to the robot.
Maid. A maid replaces that.
But the cost of that maid is completely different.
No. So now we're going into a cost argument. I'm saying from an innovation standpoint. What use case cannot be done without AI? You're telling me use cases that exist today that can be done without AI. You're just saying it's cheaper.
Yeah, so that is the innovation.
So you're saying the only innovation with AI is that it's just going to drive costs down.
Yes, it will drive costs down, but I think, okay, let's say a Siri, as an example, Siri in the past has not used LLMs. You can imagine a world where Siri gets really good as a personal assistant that you can access anywhere you want at like any time.
Is that something that customers need and want?
I mean, for me,
I say this as someone having worked on Alexa.
okay, I think we should probably move on. Like, we could just get caught up in a.
We can't. Okay, well, let's summarize. Basically, where I'm coming from right now is I don't think I don't know that we've validated the demand exists just because the cost comes down. I think cost coming down is going to create more AI startups that will invest. It may lead to the future, but to go specifically for Jevon's paradox, I do not think that cost and cost alone is the limiting factor that will lead to more AI usage.
I think it's Jevon's paradox. I'm just gonna finish with it. Jevon's paradox plus AI getting a lot better is what's going to lead to the specific solution to particular use cases is what's going to get it better, is what's going to bring up adoption into the future.
Yeah, that's basic. Like, I think we said the exact same thing then.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's move. Do you want to talk about impact on energy?
Yeah, I think from the energy. So when we talk about the chip maker declines, being overblown, I think the chip maker decline is a bit overblown. I think the demand for chips is going to continue to exist. But when we talk about energy, again, I think that factor of the amount of energy required, I think that's going to decrease because, again, we're thinking about limitless demand. Like, we went from a world where we're thinking we need an unlimited amount of energy, which is leading to investment in nuclear, for example, where the economics of that is like just starting up the nuclear and investing in nuclear. That you do that when you're desperate for energy. But right now, if the amount of energy required is not that high, I think what's going to happen is we're going to rely on the traditional economics for energy, meaning we're going to rely on, I think, natural gas producers, for instance. They're going to do much better because you power on gas turbines when you're reaching your total amount of capacity. I don't think there is as much of a need to go beyond the current capacity. I think we do still need to increase, but I think the story of how much energy we need may come down a bit, which will inevitably impact the leading edge energy investments and rely a bit more on traditional energy investments instead. Because now it's a bit more, the amount of energy demand is going to be a bit more grounded. So I think, I think the story has changed as well for energy. And I think that story is going to be a bit stickier and harder to overcome compared to the demand for chips.
Yeah, I probably don't have too much to add to that. With that said, on predictions, I think we touched upon the short-term winners. I might talk a little bit about the long, and then if you want to add anything, Albert. I think you and I talked about this, but Apple has been an anomaly among the Mag 7, where it hasn't really made an attempt to, invest in chips or train its own model. But, it might come across as actually the winner of, of around this, because if the model is just get good enough, doesn't it necessarily have to be the cutting edge model and can be applied at a lower cost across, its billion Apple devices and can be run locally in some instances. It just means, you know, Apple hasn't been able to invest but reap all the benefits around AI.
Yeah, I agree. I think that ties into like the investment in custom silicon. I mean, like, you said Apple hasn't been investing in chips. I'm going to qualify that. I'm going to say Apple has not been investing in massive data centers, which is what you meant, but they have invested heavily in their own proprietary chips that are used to power the iPhones and the Macs today. And that is where Apple's edge is they do have that custom silicon, which is going to come in for the inferencing side. They don't need to invest in the massive data centers for training, but they do have the edge with the silicon for edge computing for edge uses of AI. And so I think they will definitely benefit. I also do believe they're a long-term winner, not a short-term winner, because I think they still haven't cracked that use case for AI. Apple Intelligence, unfortunately, has not gone over very well. And so I think they will continue to refine, they will continue to get better. But until they crack the consumer use case for AI, I don't think they'll see that benefit.
Yeah, I one question that's coming to my mind, was this always part of Apple's strategy? Or was this just a strategic choice they made early on where they said, you know what, we did Apple Maps, not being the best product out there. Um, can we actually be the best at training LLMs? Maybe not. Maybe we should considering focusing on a partnership strategy around LLMs, and where it makes sense for us to train LLMs for small use cases to run on edge. We will do that, but we're not going to overinvest and try to compete where it's not potentially where we have a head start or strength in. Um, and so maybe it was a masterstroke strategy piece that Apple has, completed here.
I mean, so first of all, I'm gonna say there are dozens of people that like Apple Maps. But second of all, I'm gonna say like that strategy as well. Like what you've articulated is pretty much what Amazon said as well. I think it was like in one of the interviews with Matt Garman and I think Andy Jassy also said similar things. They did not see it worth investing in, like they said, we're going to kind of take a wait and see approach. We're not going to invest in our own AI models. Technically they did. We have Amazon Titan and Nova and all these now, so we do invest in some of the models, but we haven't put as much in as like OpenAI and Microsoft threw into OpenAI, because we thought that we could be a broker. Like that's where AWS shines. AWS is a platform where customers can choose what kinds of models they want to use from all the other models out there. And so then Amazon doesn't have to be the first party model provider. They become the essentially kind of a marketplace for AI and the infrastructure for AI. So what you described for Apple is, I think Amazon kind of took a similar take. Instead of focusing on custom silicon for iPhones and devices, which is Apple's strength, Amazon took that for their strength, which is AWS and cloud infrastructure. So I think Amazon as well is a winner, because now it validates that you don't need that. Even though we did invest in Anthropic, we don't necessarily need all of that because now we're going to see a plethora of models increase in the future.
With that said, let's move on to our next topic here.
Yes.
I actually, do you want to quickly touch upon this piece here before we move on?
Yes, I do want to talk a bit about this. I think we talked about Apple and Amazon as winners. We did not talk about Meta. Meta is the biggest winner, in my opinion. The reason for that is Meta is, out of all the businesses out there, Meta is one of the companies that actually benefits and it has a positive return on AI today. And so Meta has invested a lot in data centers. They're building one in New Orleans about the size of Manhattan. Like I can see where my apartment would have been covered there. I can see where some of my old haunts were covered. So yeah, Meta is definitely investing in this. But the reason that Meta's invested in all this is, and interestingly enough, their foundational model, Llama, they've made that open source because Meta's business benefits from AI. they need a leading edge. They need a very, very good AI model. But what they're banking on is other people creating better and better models. That's why they went the open source approach. So others could tweak it, refine it, make it better without them having to invest in building that model. So they invest a little bit. They have the infrastructure ready to create and deploy the AI, but in terms of actually developing it, they want the best possible model, and they don't want to hedge on the risk that they have the best engineers to build the best model. Instead, they're kind of disseminating that and letting other startups like Deepseek create better models, which will make their business more powerful.
I think what's interesting is that's a opposite strategy of Google. I
Yes.
would say Google, similar to Meta,
Yeah.
has, both in advertising businesses, both have over a billion users, providing personalized recommendations, et cetera, et cetera. You know, they have a lot to win, but they've gone a more closed sourced approach, equally reliant on LLMs for their products as well. So yeah, will be interesting to see how it all plays out.
I like that. I never thought about that way, but I absolutely 100% agree. I think it is absolutely the inverse of a Meta. And I think share prices have reflected that.
Okay, let's talk foundational models. So obviously, I think this is probably where the biggest impact around DeepSeek has been. So yeah, I might hand over to you, Albert, and then I'll jump in with a few of my thoughts.
Yeah. I think we talked a bit about it before, but basically what distillation means is any business that's investing in the foundational models, so like for instance the OpenAIs and the Anthropics of the world, they are bearing the cost for their competitors. They're essentially subsidizing their competitors. OpenAI invested, billions to create O1 and O3, and yes, they are leading edge, but what what DeepSeek did was they basically just used the outputs as high quality training data to make their own R1 model. And so what this is and technically it's against the terms of service. So if OpenAI wants to sue, I'm sure they have a case here. But I think what this says is any business that takes the time to invest in building the very, very best model, and we were talking about that earlier, you're just subsidizing your competitors. So the question is, what is the incentive for a business to create your own unique foundational model? And the problem is, web distillation doesn't require you to be open source or not. As long as you have some API or as long as your model is accessible by users, you're at threat for someone using that as training data.
Yeah, that is the case, right? Although if you're an American startup and you try to distill OpenAI Anthropic's model, and it actually is as good as their model, I mean, it's harder to pursue a company based overseas in China. But if you're based in Europe or Western jurisdictions, they're going to come after you. Do you think Sam Altman's? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So, I think there probably is still a broader question here around, will a Western based company come up with a low cost open source model outside of Llama? I think Llama will get there. And I think Llama is probably going to be that benchmark, but you will see a small players coming out like a research lab, like a Deepseek, like maybe like a Berkeley AI lab as an example.
Yeah,
I don't know.
not a Berkeley lab, but speaking of that, I mean, AI2 today did announce that they created a new model that beats the DeepSeek reasoning model as well. And again, what this is showing us is the pace of the model development is becoming more and more commoditized. I think we're reaching a point where you're not going to have that oligopoly of model owners anymore. This is not going to be like the foundry business. We're now going to have a lot of models, meaning that the foundational model companies are going to have a very difficult time finding what is the value add that they get from investing so much in building these models. What do you
Yeah.
think OpenAI needs to do now?
So I think this is an interesting point where, as a builder, as a consumer of, let's say, API token from OpenAI, if we just have the side by side comparison of the cost, right? So probably DeepSeek Reasoner, which is their R1 model, is probably comparable to O1 here. But you can see the, input cost is about $15 per million tokens, whereas it looks like it's about, between 55 cents to $2 for a similar amount. So that's a huge decrease in price, right? And all of a sudden, if I'm a startup, Deepseek is open source, which means, to your point, you know, you can access the weights and have it hosted on someone else's server so that your data doesn't go towards China. Why would I use OpenAI and play, more than, several folds of the price? Like, why?
Yeah. Doesn't make sense.
Not. I'm not. If I get a similar outcome, I'm not using OpenAI because it's stupid because I'm going to have to pay way more than I need to pay, right? So I think that drastically changes the economics of OpenAI. And I think there was some rumor where OpenAI is losing $1.5 billion or $5 billion a year right now. And that's impacting on Microsoft's P&L. But that completely changes OpenAI's economics. They cannot charge the same amount for their models anymore. So all of a sudden, OpenAI has just had their margins cut several times over, right? Which is pretty uncanny. So I think this is going to be a challenge for almost all LLMs, whether you're OpenAI or you're Anthropic, where, you've got the best models in market, but if someone just has something just good enough at a, 80% less of the cost, it means you've got no choice but to lower your cost.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it's gonna be like in this kind of model where there's, previously the moat was that it was super expensive and not everyone could invest to do it. Now, if it's, cheaper and cheaper, I think that's going to lead to a lot of businesses doing it. I think that's also going to lead to a better, like more specialized models as well. Right now, like the race has always been on general purpose, but if it is cheaper, and going to your question that you asked before in terms of will there be more, smaller businesses, countries investing in their own LLMs? I think we will begin seeing a lot of, countries out there and, smaller businesses doing so. And I think when we're thinking about who is investing in chips, previously it's basically hyperscalers have the vast majority of investment. But now I think even if hyperscaler demand drops, we see a growing long tail of investment because now there's so many other businesses, so many other people coming out to create their own models, or just leverage other models that are out there, because now, it's so accessible. I think the to your point, the only reason someone would go to build one is you're probably not going to build another general purpose if, DeepSeek's already built one. What you're probably going to do is create a specialized model. Like, I don't know, if you have an Australian model, it'll know all the Australian nuances and use Australian English instead of American English. Stuff like that. I'm just, but some kind of specialized difference.
Yeah. And, startups are getting smarter around how to use this. They know not for every use case they need to use O1. They could use a 4.0 mini. They could use, another model. So jumping into predictions here, I think anyone that's invested hundreds of millions of dollars into some of the smaller foundational model players, the Mistrals, the Coheres of the world, there's several others that I haven't named. I think they see slower funding. All of a sudden, you're like, number one, can they compete against hyperscalers plus open AIs of the world and topics? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think not from a funding standpoint or talent standpoint. And then if there's so much increased competition from, DeepSeek, Alibaba's model, some of these research labs that you mentioned, I've got so many options as a builder. I don't need to use, why would I use your models, right? If it's more expensive. And if you do reduce the cost, your economics just get splashed out because you're still spending a lot to train your models. So, I think that's going to be an area where some investors may feel some pain. And then, Albert, do you want to share a bit about the long term or anything you want to add on the short term?
Yeah, just one more thing I'll say on the short term. Ursula, I 100% agree with what you said. I do want to, well, 90% agree with what he said. What he said is, I don't think they can compete. I think the thing is, I think this increases their ability to compete, but I think everyone loses because everyone is now so much better at competition. I think the Mistrals and Coheres of the world, they have to compete because that is their business. And now they have the ability to invest in efficiency, which is really going to hurt Anthropic and really going to hurt OpenAI now. I think OpenAI and Anthropic are going to fight back because they can also invest in efficiency. So everyone is investing in efficiency, and they're going to be more. They're going to do this in a better way, but they're all burning cash to do it. I think everyone loses as a result of that.
But I think the difference is there's more market power, more scale to some of these larger players. They might be able to have a higher cash burn rate just just to hold out. It's similar like
They could,
yeah,
but I guess
yeah.
it comes back to, is the return worth the higher, like the investment, right? Like O1 is still better than DeepSeek R1, but R1 was done at a fraction of the cost. If it costs you 10 times more to produce a like 1.1x better result, is that worth the scale? So basically what we're saying is the scale is not as big a factor anymore.
No, and I think at the end of the day, it all comes to use case by use case, right? Yes. So some use cases need the O3 API, some just need 4.0 mini. It just depends.
Yeah. And I
And
think
then
that's going to come down to the use cases. Like, if we do see agentic AI as what the world is going to be, like, we're not going to be able to rely on the smaller, cheaper reasoning models today. We'll need to see what kind of models, like, work best for agentic AI and see if the cost for those come down. But I think one area I do want to dig into is what can these businesses do, the ones that have the scale, the distribution, the brand name. I think what they can do is they can invest in better, like, specific vertical use cases. And so, like, for instance, OpenAI right now, they announced ChatGPT Gov. And then I think today they announced that they're involving their AI models in America's nuclear safety standards, and healthcare as well. And I think, that's interesting because because they have that scale. I disagree that scale necessarily means that they're going to produce much better results, but their scale and brand name lets them get certified for government contracts, and that is something that startups can't do. So that's how I think, like, pursuing those kind of siloed businesses and becoming an expert in that field. I think they're going to be able to get that first mover advantage, especially for government contracts. The moat is not the technology. The moat is the fact that the government will sign with you. That's not easy to get. So I think they're going to build moats through business means and use case means as opposed to technological means.
yeah, and I think that's a good segue into our final topic. Oh, which is the application layer. But do you want to quickly touch upon this one here, Albert, before we go on?
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about this already. We don't need to spend too much time, but just basically this illustrates, DeepSeek R1 versus O1, just the similarity in quality for a vast reduction in price. I think this is telling us, like, I think when you look at O3 versus, O1, it's going to be the same thing. O3 is going to be a better improvement in quality, but for a massive, massive increase in price. And so the question is, do businesses want quality or do they want cheaper? And that's going to come down to the use cases. Some use cases are solved by cheaper models. Some are solved by quality. We'll have to see if quality gets cheaper as well. And we'll have to see if businesses or customers value quality. I suspect that they do. But I think that's basically the next thing to watch is we'll see the divide of models. We'll see the cheap and the good. And over time, once we hit the limit on the good, maybe that's AGI, that's when it begins to come down.
Yeah, agree. So with our final topic here, you know, which we talks about more the application layer, and I'm going to split this up between enterprises and startups. Number one, no Fortune 500 enterprise is going to use DeepSeek.
Well, let me say, Microsoft has just offered DeepSeek available hosted on Azure. So I'm going to challenge that no Fortune 500 company will. I think there may be some, but it's just specifically not hosted by DeepSeek.
Yeah. So number one, not hosted by DeepSeek. I think in the short run, yes, we will probably see some use cases, hosted within a private cloud environment around DeepSeek. But I suspect Llama is going to be there pretty quickly. And the moment Llama gets there, as a Fortune 500 enterprise, would you be using DeepSeek even though it's hosted, in a closed environment? Or would you more trust an American model that's just as good at the same
Yeah.
price? Like my view is I'd still trust the American model.
Yeah.
And then I think on the startup aspect, I think we talked about this, if I'm spending 20 cents per query or API call anytime anyone clicks or asks something, but it gets to 1 cent, 0.5 cents, maybe it's run locally on the device even. Um, that to me unlocks a whole new way of how I can incorporate AI into my products as a startup founder. Um, so, I think the short-term predictions is if you don't believe Mark Zuckerberg and Llama is going to get to O1 level of performance, I think you're kidding yourself. Like they're going to get there fairly quickly. Um, and I see startups and enterprises actually adopting this, and OpenAI will either be forced to, you know, down a more vertical based route where they build more specific solutions that rely on the brand distribution, or they go down a route where they become super efficient and they lower the cost, which is not ideal. Um,
Or I guess another option as well is OpenAI attempts to be the leading edge provider by producing really expensive but very very high quality models like O3. That's another angle as well. I think if OpenAI does go down, I don't think OpenAI should go down the cost like trying to. Well, they should invest in cost reduction, but that should not be their focal point because if they invest in cost, that's a race to the bottom. I think OpenAI loses if they do that because they're going to face so much competition. But because they have the resources that they do, they're about to get another SoftBank investment. I think where they are going to succeed is, in addition to the vertical use cases, I think it's going to be attempting to be leading edge. Um, and I think everyone else is also going to try, but so far it looks like OpenAI is still in the lead there.
yeah. And I think we've touched upon the long-term one quite a bit through our Jevons paradox discussion. But I think just to sum up this podcast, I think with DeepSeek, everyone knew this day was coming where models become more efficient and lower cost. I think no one expected it at this pace.
Yes. And not by a Chinese firm as well.
Yeah, I think everyone expected this to be 2 or 3 years away at least, where there's still a significant amount of investment around chips and hardware and energy. Um, Although it just means it accelerates everything. And then it just goes to show, every couple of days, every couple of weeks, the whole landscape can get upturned, which is really exciting and scary at the same time.
It certainly is. Well, I'm wondering how long it'll be before we have the next episode about the next industry shattering uh, event. I suspect it'll be within a month.
Well, yeah, like I think if OpenAI can get O3 out to a low cost. So I've heard rumors that O3 Mini is coming out tomorrow.
Yes.
And if that does, be interesting to see how good it is.
I'm excited to talk about it next week.
Yeah. So we'll see. But yeah, with that said, any last things you want to add, Albert?
No, I think just to kind of summarize this conversation, I still think that we're now moving past the technology and the economics. I think what matters now is the use cases. I think we are going to see a race for who can come up with those use cases and build a business model that is defensible because now everyone's going to have AI. And that is exciting, but also I think it's going to be really interesting to see the business strategies that emerge because of this.
Definitely. Okay. Thanks so much for listening in. Cheers.
All right. Thanks all.
All right.